Welcome, Twilight.
What's going on?
Hey, brother, how you doing?
Living the dream. How about you?
You're what?
Just living the dream.
Living that dream. Yeah, it's a heck of a dream. It's uh, it's a fever dream.
Kind of is.
Well, let's see here. Path is going to be a little late. So hey, this new time that we're starting an hour later, does that work for you?
Yeah, it should. Tonight, I should be good at least. Well, tonight probably till about 9:30 Eastern time. So, for me, yeah, I mean, I got a good hour and a half in me at least.
Yeah, this is
Um,
a
and,
short. This is a short
okay,
class.
yeah, that works.
The
Yeah, no,
reading was pretty short. Go ahead.
yeah, I think it should be fine.
Uh-oh. Let's see what's happening here. Okay. Well, this is going to be a short one anyway. What did you think about the reading?
I didn't have the strongest opinion of this reading. Um, I at least when I compare him to Paul, I was left missing Paul for different reasons because, well, right up front, the writing style. I mean, I know it's kind of superficial, but I really could not stand how he wrote. It really bothered me, and
Sure,
I'm
sure.
but that's really a pet peeve. That's really not. It takes away from the
No, that
point.
that that counts. That's a legitimate thing to think about when reading any of these guys. But I agree with you. By the way,
Yeah,
Henry Thomas Buckle's not that impressive in a number of ways.
right. Yeah, I could tell he was. I don't know. It just seemed like he was grasping. I do think the point he made was interesting. I'll give him that. I mean, I think it's again, it is it's it's something to ponder to think about. How because it seemed like his whole point was on regularity, but then he was taking regularity and sort of saying like making that the basis of proof that like things are determined, and I just think that's just a really weak um I don't know, like way to support your belief in determinism. Although it is interesting. I mean, I guess the concept of regularity is interesting in itself, but I just as like support, I think
Yeah.
it's very weak.
Well, it is interesting as its own point. And you know, we'll talk about the point he makes in a minute, but it's sort of a good argument. I mean, I don't think it's a very good argument, but the strength of his argument might be something like it's an empirical verification of determinism. In other words, if determinism is true, you should be able to predict even human behavior. And he's saying, I can predict human behavior. And so that fits right along with the idea that it's not about your free choices, it's about the circumstances in which you find yourself. And since I can predict that with such great regularity, that's just proof that you don't have free will. It's kind of an argument. Um, I do feel like it's pretty weak for some reasons that we'll talk about, but and I also feel disappointed with him compared to Paul. Paul, I feel like you do. Bring back Paul. I don't like his argument, but damn, it's strong. Compared to this, I feel. Um,
Yeah, I think one of the weaknesses I felt was like one of the first things I thought about was he makes this exception sort of as to like, well, why does regularity ever change? Because there's like a change in culture or something. And it's like, well, that's kind of the rub. That's like, in my opinion, it kind of, he kind of brushes it off, but I feel like that's it's actually more disqualifying probably than he thinks, because if enough people have free will, that will reflect in like social changes, and then he can just kind of brush that off and say, well, social changes are now why things aren't regular, but social changes happen for a reason because of free will. So it's like he doesn't,
Yeah, he wouldn't say because of free will, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, he would certainly say um, oppositely. He would say, I guess my argument was that,
Right.
you know, it's at least conceivable people could have free will, and if enough free will actors acted, then the collective would change, and then once the collective changes, he conveniently brushes it aside, like saying like, oh, well, that's why regularity is no, that's why regularity has changed because the collective has changed.
Yeah, he does. So he says, look how strongly I can predict with regularity what people will do. It can't be because of their free choices. It's because of the situation they're in." And then, like you say, he says, well, we can't do that perfectly because there's a lot of factors to take into account. And when those things change, that will account for why we're wrong sometimes. It's like, okay, you're sort of trying to hamstring the objections that could come against you by asserting that you believe that if you knew all the factors, then you would be able to predict perfectly. Which, it's a fair enough thing for him to say if he's able to predict really well, and he says, I am able to predict really well. But like you said, he can't say it's because of free will that the antecedents change. He also can't say it's because of chance, because that would be making it impossible to predict as well. He has to believe in a deterministic position. So free will, chance, anything that could break the chain of causality would be unacceptable to him from his scientific historical perspective. All right, let's get into this. I know Path is going to be a little late today, but so Henry Thomas Buckle is often called the father of scientific history, which is a redundancy, of course, because history already has an empirical requirement to it. But that's okay. The father of modern history or modern scientific history, something like that might work. He was an accomplished chess player at the age of 19, which was not the first thing he was accomplished. Well, yeah, it's the first thing he was accomplished in, perhaps. But his mother taught him to read at home. He was homeschooled for a while. His father occasionally would read Shakespeare to the family in the evenings. His mother introduced him to The Thousand and One Nights and the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress and Shakespeare. So he grew up reading those texts. I think he went to school at the age of 14 and shortly after convinced his mother to bring him home again, and he was regarded as like one of the top chess players in the world at the age of 19. And he just sort of took over his own education by his own report for the rest of his life, kind of like what we're doing, where we say, look, education's my education is my responsibility. And I'm reading and thinking and talking and debating and all of that because I'm interested in the subject. And he didn't really enjoy school. In any case, he got the idea at some point that he should write a book on history. And I think he had a pretty large, ambitious project to do something like the entirety of human history or something. But he ended up spending, I don't know, half a dozen years working on a manuscript that was eventually published called History of Civilization in London or England or something like that. So he was a historian. And let's move on to the excerpts of his essay here. So the summation of what we've read, excuse me, goes as such. So I agree with Paul is basically what he's saying. If I knew all of the circumstances surrounding an historical figure and fully understood his mental states, So take a historical figure, understand everything surrounding his situation and his actual mental states, his inclinations, his constitution. I should be able to accurately predict exactly what he will do in history. Therefore, if we predict wrongly, our history must be incomplete. We must look for new information regarding his circumstances or his inclinations, right? That's his statement, is that because it's deterministic, because I believe it's possible to do history and it's possible to make sense of this, I have to think about it the same way that Paul is thinking about things, Paul Ray, which is that there are explanations for why people do what they do, that it's not just happening without any other explanation besides the fact that they are an agent and manifested something. It has to do with exactly their character and exactly their circumstances. And if I knew everything about all those, I should be able to predict perfectly, because look, I know an awful lot about their motivations and I can predict what they do. And I can explain what they do after the fact. And so I'm being a historian, and it certainly seems to me that there's no other way to do that except to think it's possible to make sense of history. And the only way I could do that is to think that it's based in something reasonable, that I could look at it from the outside. I don't need special privileged access to the agency component of a person. Okay. And then he says, if we could mathematize all of this, then we'd really be getting somewhere. If we could measure the regularity year by year, he's thinking, what if we could do this? If we could have a model of human behavior, right? So, or things that happen in history, at least. If we could measure with regularity year by year of death and disease in a city, we would have a number indicating how much fluctuation exists as a result of the many complicated factors that collectively govern the instances of disease and death. Okay, so if only we could, record how many people die in London of each disease each year, we could then do a standard deviation calculation. We could say, okay, it's not only around this number, but here it'll never be higher than this and it'll never be lower than this unless some big factors change, right? And then he says, but we can do this, and we have. Now imagine we were to do the same thing with a kind of human behavior, say murder. If we could see how much fluctuation there were in murders in a certain city. But we have done this. We've done this too. This is possible, right? I can predict the effect of disease, but I can also predict how often people will make certain choices. So if I can predict it, it's based in factors that are available to me. And so, what are you talking about, this free will thing? It's all just determined. And otherwise I wouldn't be able to understand it this way. He says, we have done this too. Perhaps you will be surprised to find that the regularity of the second contains less fluctuation than the first. Not only can we predict how many people will commit murders in a city, we can predict it better than we can predict how many people will die of the flu. That's just diseases. There's no free will in the germs. It should be simpler to predict that. It's actually more, you can predict with greater accuracy behaviors of people, like how many will get married, how many couples will get married this year, or how many people will commit suicide or something like that in a town. Because of this, I feel that human behavior can be quantified in principle, and that history should be done in this way so that we can plug in numbers to various factors and successfully predict the behaviors of humans. It's a pretty radical thing to say, sort of. Obviously, the trend has existed philosophically. There's been people who felt this way about things for a long time, but imagine how this must have felt to people when he was first publishing it. Because the increase or decrease of suicides in a society is predictable based on the struggles to which the members of that society are subjected year by year, the offenses of men, quote, are the result not so much of the vices of the individual offender as of that state of society into which that individual is thrown. Right? There's his deterministic. That's what he believes. Quote, the great social law that the moral actions of men are the product not of their volition, but of their antecedents, is itself liable to disturbance which troubles its operation without affecting its truth. That's the objection that Twilight brought up, where he's saying, like, well, I can't do this perfectly, but I'll sort of sweep that under the rug a little bit and say I can do it pretty well, which means, it's a lot of complicated factors, but, and here's where he really doubles down on it. Quote, to those who have a steady conception of the regularity of events and have firmly seized the great truth that the actions of men, being guided by their antecedents, are in reality never inconsistent, but, however capricious they may appear, only form part of one vast scheme of universal order, of which we, in the present state of knowledge, can barely see the outline. To those who understand this, which is at once the key and the basis of history, the facts just adduced, so far from being strange, will be precisely what would have been expected. There's his empiricism, right? And ought long since to have been known. Indeed. So look at his argument there, right? This is an empirical argument. He's saying, I told you that I can predict the number of I don't know if YouTube is really triggered by the word suicide. I'm kind of annoyed that there isn't a platform where adults can just freaking speak, but I noticed that a lot of people say self-harm or something like that, whatever. Okay, so it's so annoying to live in constantly censored media. In any case, he says, I can predict the number of people who will harm the self, or whatever terminology you're supposed to use, in a city in a year. And I can predict it with greater regularity than I can even predict with fewer fluctuations. I can predict that regularity, that's his language, greater than, with fewer fluctuations than if I was predicting how many people will fall off a cliff or how many people will die of a disease, of whooping cough or something in a year. Now, that would not be what you would predict if you modeled human behavior in a libertarian sort of way, he says. But if you model it in a deterministic sort of way, that's exactly what you would predict, right? So that's how he's making his argument. He's saying, here's the truth. You never would have predicted that if you thought that free will was the major thing going on here. But if you thought that men's behaviors are reasonably comprehensible, not that they're being reasonable, but that you can use reason to understand how in this situation they will choose these things, then you wouldn't find that strange. So far from being strange will be precisely what would have been expected and ought long to since have been known. Indeed, the progress of inquiry is becoming so rapid and so earnest that I entertain little doubt that before another century has elapsed, the chain of evidence will be complete, and it will be as rare to find an historian who denies the undeviating regularity of the moral world as it now is to find a philosopher who denies the regularity of the material world. There's strengths in this argument. There's weaknesses in the argument. He writes that last sentence pretty well. I mean, he's at least boldly saying, this is what I think. And we didn't have much to read in this excerpt. So we'll do one question. No, we'll save the question. Let's just open it up for discussion. What do y'all think about the reading that we just summarized? About Buckle's arguments. I know Twilight was expressing that they're a little bit disappointingly not as strong as Paul's, and I share that feeling. But was anybody really impressed with this? Did it bring up an idea that you'd never thought of before, or was it more convincing than you thought it would be? Or is there an obvious weakness in all of this that makes you want to shout and jump and say, hey, Henry, shut up. Look at what you're missing.
Yeah, I'd say I get despite its being an interesting topic, like, regularity, predictability, I guess there's probably a lot of different angles that you could attack it from. And one of them that came to mind would be, I don't know, like a conceivable reality that would that would disprove what he's saying is this, and it's like it would be maybe like a compatibilist argument, and it's basically, it could be like, what if a lot of people were had their actions were determined, but some people had sort of like some people had more free will. And so in this reality, say if 80% of people, their actions were determined, that would still that would satisfy this regularity. So you would still be able to predict things in the way that he's saying if 80% of people were living deterministically, and that 20% who I think there's a spectrum, and I think that some have more free will than others, and some lose their free will sometimes, whatever. But just kind of a rough sketch is that even if it's 10%, 5%, or whatever, I think that there can still exist minorities of people who are exceptions to the role that they get missed by the statistics, but he wouldn't be able to know because you wouldn't see them in the statistics because it's a smaller percent, and he doesn't have a way of accounting for that, basically.
That's the best argument against Buckle. It's absolutely, and I think there's nothing in his essay that answers that objection. Essentially, what's happening is this. One of the things we don't want to do if we're doing philosophy, and if we read his essay here, I don't know exactly why Edwards and Pabst decided to include this in the chapter, in the section on determinism, because it doesn't seem to be much of a philosophical argument to prove determinism. But if we take it to be the aim of this article, of this excerpt, to prove determinism, it absolutely does not. And for the reason that you say, and one of the things we don't want to do when we do philosophy is argue very successfully against an absurd absolute that the other side mostly doesn't hold. Almost nobody on the other side actually holds. So what I mean is, most libertarians believe something like what you just said, that there are degrees of freedom, that some people are more free than others, some people are not free at all, that most of the decisions made by an individual are not due to their free agency, but some are, right? To be a libertarian, all you have to do is believe that sometimes people have choices and they can act as agents in the world. It doesn't mean that everything anybody does is not predictable and totally not influenced. I mean, so there's three things. One, a certain number of people might not have this liberty. Everybody might have it to some degree. Even the people who have it most might not exercise it in their everyday life most of the time. So it's only a minority of their decisions that are utilizing any agency at all. And if a libertarian had anything like that perspective, they would predict that with a certain amount of fluctuation, you probably could predict with the regularity and measure the regularity and the fluctuation of most actions in a society, right? That's not actually a piece of evidence that would explode the libertarian position, since most libertarians don't have an absurd absolute notion of liberty where it says everything I do, I'm completely free of any influence. I mean, that's an absurd position. I mean, almost nobody could think something like that. Because you couldn't make sense of anything that way. However, it doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as, that alone doesn't disprove, that argument from Buckle doesn't disprove that there couldn't possibly be something like agency or liberty manifest in the cosmos. So yeah, I think with that argument of yours, I think we have to say that the Henry Buckle excerpt is nothing like the Paul Ray excerpt, which is actually doing some philosophical work to try to prove something on this debate. It's just an example of a historian who has a tendency to think in a deterministic way and finds that way of thinking works pretty well by and large for him. Another objection we might bring up is this, which is, congratulations, Henry. You can predict that there will be around 273 marriages in London this year, plus or minus about 12 or 13. Congratulations. This model of yours Does it let you predict if this particular couple will get engaged this year? Oh, it doesn't do that at all? Okay. Um, I'm not sure you're proving what you think you're proving here. Or maybe he is. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's right. He's talking about in general as averages, right? And I think you're getting to the point of look, this couple, or you look as individuals, there isn't an average couple, there isn't an average individual, and to be able to right correlate that across is a pretty far stretch.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the average American has one ball and one tit.
Right.
We might be getting to a culture where that's more accurate than it sounds. But in any case, yeah. So, in other words, one of the responses that somebody might be able to marshal against what Paul Ray is saying is say, look, buddy, if what you want to do is analyze the public general conceptions of human behavior, sure, you can think in that way, and that's a great way to think. But that doesn't help you at all when you think about the individual. And the individual is the only realm in which we talk about freedom existing, right? So um, you're not disproving liberty existing in the only place that we ever talk about it existing. We don't talk about, most libertarians wouldn't talk about liberty as a group function, an emergent property of a community, right? They think reasonably that over averages things start to look more predictable and general like that, but that doesn't make most libertarians go, oh my gosh, what does that mean about us as individuals? But there could be a bit of a point there, like if I mean, so another problem would be this: to say, okay, well, if people are so free, this would be Henry Buckle talking. If people are so free, then why, as a group, can I predict how they're going to behave? And somebody could respond this way as well. Here's a third or fourth response, which would be, people behave according to their character and their agency. And those characters are not that different from one another. So it's still predictable. You can still do a group analysis and say the average person acts like this without saying that the average person or every individual doesn't have some degree of liberty in those same actions. I don't think that I'm not saying this is what I believe, but I don't think that response is philosophically laughable or anything. I think most libertarians don't think of liberty as existing on a group level. So to observe the fact that when analyzing things on a group level, you don't observe any liberty functioning is sort of like missing the point to some degree. Like the libertarians were never talking about liberty emerging as a group property. There was some insect spray in my house to deal with this dog and ticks and things, and I think it's messing with my brain. So we're probably going to end early tonight and deal with the neurological damage we're causing ourselves from this, and probably go outside for a walk. So anyway, was that at least coherent? I'm I'm feeling unsure of whether or not I'm making coherent sentences right now.
No, I think that actually makes sense. It's kind of from an angle that I wasn't quite thinking from that angle, but yeah, that kind of clarifies my thinking on it too. I guess from a different.
I only got that idea from your other objection. Yeah, all these objections, I think every objection that both of you have brought up and the ones that I was trying to outline, I think they really do hold. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to Henry Buckle's argument. I'm not even really sure he was trying to make a philosophical case for determinism, anything like Paul Ray was. I think he was just generally talking about how it applies to history, and I'm not sure that it's fair of Edwards and Pabst to include this excerpt as part of the case for determinism. So I'm not trying to dismiss it too readily, but I think there's anybody, I would say anybody who's convinced of determinism just by reading Henry Buckle probably just wanted to believe in determinism. Whereas Paul Ray can be convincing. I think Paul Ray could introduce ideas that might make it hard for someone not to believe in determinism if you can take Paul Ray seriously, and I think he's accomplishing a bit more than Henry Buckle was. And I'm not even sure Henry Buckle was really trying to establish this on the deductive, philosophical, solid argument case that Paul Ray was. But that being said, all of these objections do seem to hit him. You know what I mean? Like, one of the things we don't want to do in this class is think we've knocked down some argument when we haven't really hit the argument. But I think all of these objections are, they're blows that land on Henry Buckle. I think that's fair. Twilight, you were going to say something?
No, I was going to kind of echo in agreement that I think that is more so the fault of the book compilers for, like you said, putting this in there rather than it being Henry's kind of error. Because I don't know, like you said, that he was setting out to make the case for determinism rather than, he was, that might not have been his intention. But, upon reading it, finishing it, I was like, it's like at commercial, like, where's the meat?
Yeah.
I was like waiting for, surely there's something like extra here that they just forgot to put in, because I did see some grammar errors.
I felt largely the same as you. I will say that the one thing he says that is a little bit surprising and kind of impressive is when his main point, when he points out that, look, you believe that you can analyze the regularity of diseases statistically. And look, I can do the same with suicide or murder or something like that in a society. But then he goes, the fluctuations are smaller in the second case than they are in the first. That might not be something that a libertarian would be inclined to predict. It might not explode a libertarian's position, but he makes a point when he says, you wouldn't expect that to be the case, except that I point out to you that it is the case. And so maybe my deterministic inclination is more justifiable than you think. All right. Well, with that, we'll try to be as fair to him as we can. There's some question or two. There's a couple of questions. With that, we'll be as fair to him as we can be. And there's a couple of questions on the website if you guys feel like answering them. To wrap up this before we go to the after show, I'm just going to say, if I were to organize this section on determinism and free will, I would have probably started with the determinists and then gone to John Stuart Mill and done some libertarianism. And then we would have dealt with compatibilism and pseudo-problemists, which are a type of compatibilists. And we would have looked at some of the other perspectives on the question. And then we would have finished with William James and his pragmatism. I think the proper place for this, for William James, is at the very end, because you've got sort of simple deductive argument, belief that you've got a total answer in determinism, and then the opposite side of the coin where you really think you've got it all figured out in libertarianism and agency, and then the sophisticated compatibilist views that say, wait a minute, there might not be a problem and you can have your cake and eat it too, which is, most people, when they hear, I believe the world is deterministic and we have free will, think that's retarded. It's what? No, you don't. Those things are contradictory. And it's quite sophisticated. What some of the compatibilists do is very impressive. And so then I would have looked at that and said, okay, well, it's either this, or maybe you can have both and. And then I would have gone to William James, who says, actually, everybody who thinks they have this answer figured out is wrong, because it's not the sort of answer that is amenable to a deductive, confident position. It's an article of faith, no matter which side you are on, to some degree. And he doesn't just assert that, he demonstrates that that's the case philosophically, which is quite impressive. And then moves on to, William James. Well, we'll talk about William James next time, but he has first he proves that, and then he utilizes philosophical methods and principles for still trying to come to an answer on the question after showing that you can't know for sure. So I would have put him at the very end, but the way Edwards and Pabst do it is we'll be looking at William James next. So William James does believe in free will, so it makes sense to to go the other side, but it just doesn't seem to me to make sense to go to this sophisticated pragmatist approach to the other side when you could just use a straightforward libertarian to contradict it first. But in any case, we're going to do it. We're going to do it in this order. So for Tuesday, it's this class we had a very small reading to do, and it was interesting. It was an interesting essay. It complements Paul Ray nicely enough, but it was easy reading. For Tuesday, we are going to have some heavy reading, and I can already imagine that there's no way we're going to get through all of William James in one, maybe not even in two classes. So maybe I'll read a third of it, maybe I'll read a half of it, and I'll upload the recording, and I'll let you guys know how many sections we'll go through for Tuesday. If you want, I'll send you a message in the private chat group about that in case you don't want to, if you're not using my readings and you actually have the book, I'll send you that. I'll figure it out tonight and send you what it is that we're going to look at. Actually, I can just answer the damn question right now. If you'll bear with me really quickly. The dilemma of determinism. This is a cool piece to be reading. So for Tuesday, we'll read the first three sections. We'll read the first three sections of The Dilemma of Determinism by William James for Tuesday. And that's going to be a little heavier, a little more on the Paul Ray level of heavy, and I think it's more sophisticated than his actually as well. But you can make your own judgments on that. In any case, that's what we'll cover for Tuesday. And so we'll, if anybody wants to have any final things to say before we go to the after show, I'm going to end the broadcast a little early here because I don't think there's that much more to talk about with Henry Buckle. Did anybody think more about Buridan's ass, the thought experiment that we did in the after show last time? Has that popped into your mind throughout the week for any reason, or have you mulled it over, or was it?
What's interesting is I had a friend come over and told him I was taking a philosophy class, and he shared he took one in college, and that it was you brought up the example of pulling the lever with the train, which you had brought up and said, okay, this train is going to kill 4 people, but if you pull this lever, it's going to kill 1 person, right? So the instinct is to say, well, I'm going to pull the lever and it's kill 1 person. And it's like, well, now you're responsible for killing that 1 person. If you pull the lever and it kills 1 person, you're deciding it kills that 1 person instead of the 4 it was originally going to kill. It was interesting. I brought up the example with the donkey and the 2 haystacks. And we talked about that a little,
yeah.
But I can't say if anything new had come to mind as far as
Was it a fun conversation?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean,
that's perfect. Yeah,
no, definitely, because it's, as you said, it's something that you can continue to debate, back and forth.
Agreed. Yeah, well, so I had brought up the tram thought experiment just as another example of how sometimes thought experiments in philosophy can be a little silly, and
Right.
Some people like them and some people don't like them and whatever. But yeah, if you like them, they're a fun thing to talk about. And some of them are really, really powerful and really quite interesting. And some of them you wonder, it's like a little angel on the head of a pin sort of a thing or whatever. And people have different tolerance for it and different interest in it. And there's not really a wrong answer on that, I don't think. But so that's cool. So you had a friend come over and you could discuss Buridan's ass. Did you find anything in your exploration of that in that conversation that you hadn't thought of before?
No, he just had shared how his experience, they talked about utilitarianism, and just being able to see of just his experience of the class of, oh, it's for the greater good of the people, so of course that's what we're going to do. And then you do an example of the Colosseum. So you have 10,000 people cheering, and it's for their entertainment, right? While this one person just gets killed, which is the lowest of the low point, right? So looking at it in different different perspective, he just said it was really interesting to see that the teacher or someone would have a point of view, and then the professor would come back and give an alternative point of view, and then people would change their mind. He's like, it would be so ridiculous, and the professor would just see how to present the other side, just to see not that's what he thought, but to see if it would be able to change and create conversation. And he said it was just so interesting. There would be some really good and thoughtful arguments or debate, and then just some terrible terrible perspectives to it. So
Good. Well, we'll talk. That's what we'll talk about in the after show. We'll talk about the nature of formal academic settings and the kinds of conversations you can have there. So let's end this broadcast.